This hardly seems like a proportional response, but I guess it's a sign of how much things have changed since the first Trump administration.
Yeah, it's not a dollar for dollar response, Scarlett. And like you say, it's somewhat measured. There's the entity list, for example, adding Calvin Klein's owner to that. There's the antitrust probe into Google. There are tariffs on farming machinery like tractors coming out of the US into China. Some export controls on critical minerals and like tungsten, for example. Now, so none of that is on the scale of the blanket 10% tariff that President Trump put on all goods coming out of China into the US. But it signals a couple of things. First of all, it signals for now that China is willing to come to the table. They don't want to move this conflict to the next level. They're willing to talk, and we know that the administration here have said they're willing to review the initial trade agreement with China to see if they can come to terms on that. But it is also a signal from China that even if they are in a weaker position when it comes to dollar for dollar reaction, they do have ways they can retaliate. There are ways they can make life awkward for US businesses in China, and they're giving that signal in their response so far.
Right, absolutely. And maybe one way to do it is targeting U.S. companies like Alphabet. But it's a little curious because my understanding is that Alphabet's Google services are not even really operational or accessible inside China. You know, I do want to ask you about this other thing, which is, according to the Wall Street Journal, Trump and Xi Jinping are not speaking today, according to an official there. We do know that Trump has said he wants to speak with Xi Jinping soon and will look to make a deal. We don't know exactly what concessions President Trump is seeking, but they do cover some pretty familiar ground, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's very notable if both leaders are going to pick up the phone and speak in and of itself, Scarlett. That would suggest that perhaps they might come to some kind of a meeting of ways on this. Nonetheless, though, the China story is a bit different to Mexico and Canada and even Colombia, because President Trump has been consistently hawkish when it comes to trade policies towards China. He complains obviously about the merchandise goods deficit and, of course, all of the national security and the human rights and the broader issues that stoke division between the US and China. I think there has been some surprise that President Trump pushed ahead so soon with tariffs on China to 10% across the board, covering all goods, including consumer goods, given the executive orders that put in place various studies leading up to the end of March. But nonetheless, everyone will be hanging to see what comes out of that coal. But it's, I would say probably some skepticism would change President Trump's overall views on China.
Absolutely. We know that Trump wants a smaller trade deficit with China and is looking for China to also perhaps do something with TikTok, announce something that will allow TikTok to stay alive in the U.S. Specifically, though, when it comes to geopolitics Washington is also putting pressure on Beijing to help with things like the Panama Canal as well as Russia.
There's a lot on the table. As I say, on the one hand, you've got the merchandise goods deficit, OK? There's a way out of that. China could come to the table and say, we will renew our purchases of Chinese farm produce and buy other US produce, and maybe they can come to a meeting of ways on the merchandise goods side. But as you say, when it comes to national security side, efforts to control China's technological development, concerns and worries over human rights, all of that is much more complicated. And the Panama Canal, for example, is interesting too, because there's a Hong Kong company caught up in the middle of all of that. It is an indication of the broad pressure that President Trump is willing to use now. He's willing to use tariffs and the threat of tariffs as a blunt instrument when it comes to enforcing, his geopolitical sway over the country. But as I say, that's a much thornier side of things. There might be some middle ground when it comes to merchandise goods, but it's hard to see any of the other issues being resolved near term.